Hi, good afternoon. My name is Jackie Green. I'm one of the mental health nurses that works at Young Minds Matter. I also work for the School Links team, so part of our work is to offer some training. So we're doing a bit of online training. We're doing it for parents, for carers, and we're doing it for professionals as well. And today's session, for about an hour, is going to be about self-harm. So the aims of today's session is to share some understanding and hopefully gain a better understanding of what self-harm is, and to leave with some ideas of what to do to help children and young people who may be self-harming. So this session is as practical as possible. So hopefully you can take away some ideas that you'll be able to try at home, or maybe even share with some of your friends or other families who may have some questions or some concerns. So this is one thing that you might want to think about. You may want a pen and paper as you go through this session, just to kind of write down some ideas or maybe some questions that you might have. So what things come to your mind when you think about self-harm? And what does our society think about self-harm? So I suppose it's one of those individual questions. We all might have some ideas. So I'm just going to jot down some of the ideas that we hear quite a lot from other parents and other carers when they're thinking about self-harm. They'll often talk to us about the behaviours that they see or that they've heard about. And those behaviours can sometimes maybe be cutting, or they might be maybe burning. It might be an eating disorder. Maybe they're not eating as much as they would, or eating too much. What we generally hear about is it's harmful. It's something that's trying to hurt them for some reason. What we do sometimes hear about as well, and I think this is really important, if you take this kind of bit of information through the whole of the session, and maybe a take-home bit of information as well when we finish the session, is that we know that self-harm, we understand self-harm, when we talk about it, when we do these sessions face-to-face, that self-harm is a coping strategy. Coping strategy, a thing that is helpful, and sometimes that's a little bit difficult to get our heads around if it's something that's harmful at the same time. But we're thinking about coping with our emotions, maybe coping with difficult situations. I think we've all got coping strategies. So I'm just going to share a little exercise with you guys, just to share some of my coping strategies. And as I do this, you might be thinking of your own things that you do at home or at work, just on a day-to-day, particularly if something's quite difficult or stressful, or the context of your life is throwing up some challenges that might feel overwhelming. So the things that I like to do with my coping strategies are often whatever it is really that helps me feel better. On a Friday, after maybe a busy week, a hard week, a challenging week, I really look forward to getting home and having a glass of wine. Or two. I don't know. But it's something that just helps to settle me down. When I'm doing that, I really enjoy spending time with my friends and my family. Because when I'm spending time with friends and family, I'm able to talk to people. I'm able to let them know how I've been feeling, what I've been doing, and hear about their week and how they are. And we kind of just share stuff, don't we? We have a laugh, just enjoy each other's company. And I know that they're going to be listening to me and caring for me and taking what I'm saying seriously. So that's a really important part. I really enjoy exercise, because that helps me feel better, not just because of the physical benefits, but emotionally I get rid of maybe some tension or frustration or just some extra energy. I like to cook. So I've got a really kind of little space where I do, I'm quite into cooking curries at the moment, so we do some interesting recipes. So all part of that experience is finding out the new recipes and going shopping. Unfortunately, I'm in a position where I can maybe, I can do that. I've got the time to do it and the resources to do it. And the last bit, maybe, I like to read. So I've made myself a nice snug at home where I can relax, maybe with a nice wine and my favourite book. One thing to bear in mind is these are coping strategies that I can do. So I've got a vast range, and give some thought to what you do. Just imagine all of that was taken away, that you didn't have this huge range of choice, you didn't have the resources and the money and all the things that it takes and all the time. You just felt that you only had one coping strategy, one thing that helped you feel better when you were in distress or when you needed support. One thing that you could rely on, that you could trust. And that one thing for our young people and our children sometimes is self-harm. And it's a very powerful coping strategy that they feel they can rely on, that they trust and they know will help them feel better. That's just to kind of give some thought. This isn't kind of one of many choices our children and young people do. It's often because it's the only choice, as far as that young person or child is concerned, that works for them and supports them in managing the distress, the difficulties, depending on their lives and the context that they're living in. So we've just got definitions of self-harm, and I think these aren't, I'm sure there are others, but we'll just share these with you today. So self-harm is when you hurt yourself on purpose. You usually do it because something else feels wrong. It seems like the only way to let those feelings out. And I think that's it's Minds 2013. Again, it's about that lack of choice, really. A young person feels there's something in their life that is wrong, emotionally, doesn't feel right. But the only thing that they feel they can do to let those difficult feelings out somewhere is to self-harm, to do something with them, because to keep them inside is just too painful. Self-harm is a way of dealing with very difficult feelings, painful memories, or overwhelming situations that feel out of control. We could use this as a way of coping with a situation when we feel we have no other option. And I think, again, we've just mentioned about it's the one thing that can work, but also control can be a really important part of what can keep a young person or child self-harming, particularly when their lives feel very out of control, or they feel very out of control or overwhelmed emotionally. And that's when it becomes really important for that young person and that child to have something that is consistent, is reliable, and is readily available. And having a sense of control becomes more and more important, depending on what's going on in their lives. So, as behaviours that are not intended to end a person's life, and self-harm very much can be a little bit blurred with suicidal kind of thoughts or suicidal behaviours. And I think Sutton and Martison 2003, the last quote at the end, helps us to realise and understand that self-harm as a behaviour is about coping with distress, it's about managing difficult emotions, it's about finding a way of control. It's about, as strange as that might sound to us, feeling a bit better in very difficult circumstances, and is very often not about an intention to end one's life. And I think if we just kind of keep that in mind, that coping is the thing that self-harm can help that young person or child feel they can do. That's a very different perspective on the behaviour than thinking it is an intention to end one's life. So I just think that's a really important thing to be aware of as we go through the session. So what does self-harm look like? Self-harm describes a wide range of things that children and young people do to themselves in a deliberate and usually hidden way in response to their emotions. I think if we were to discuss it face to face, I'm pretty sure we would maybe be able to talk through that a little bit more. But it's certainly something that's done deliberately. But I think it's really important to realise the hidden nature, that self-harm can be quite difficult to show or talk about. And again, we don't want to kind of assume or make too many stereotypes when we're imagining who is self-harming and how that's, they're showing that to us. A lot of the time, self-harm remains a secret behaviour that can go on for a long time without being discovered. Just to bear in mind that there can be a degree of shame, there can be some fear. I know I have lots of different examples of children and young people who have been very weary about talking to, telling people, showing them their self-harming behaviour, just because they're not sure of the reaction, particularly from parents or carers, because they want that reaction to be supportive and they don't want to have a reaction maybe that makes them feel worse or increases the amount of stress and strain that they know a parent or carer is under. So again, it can be quite secret and it can, sometimes can go undiscovered for quite some time. Just at the beginning, we were going to give some thought to what behaviours we might see with self-harm. So this gives us a little bit more detail of the self-harm and what that can involve. So cutting, often to the arms and using razor blades or broken glass. And we do see that, we do hear about that. Burning, using cigarettes or liquids, punching and bruising, inserting or swallowing objects, head banging, hair pulling and overdosing. And these are all kind of referral behaviours. If we see them in Young Minds Matter, we often do hear about these types of behaviours. But again, considering that they can be on a greater or lesser extent, but that gives you a sense of the variety that self-harming behaviours can present with. So we're going to think about why children and young people self-harm. Again, feel the opportunity if you wanted to pause the video, have a think about it with whatever ideas you might have if you've got that pen and paper handy. So we understand there are certain drivers around this behaviour and there's a need to reduce, if you imagine a build-up of tension and this being a coping strategy, self-harm often reduces that tension. And when we say a safety valve, when it reduces the tension, it really prevents that emotion, that distress, that feeling of being out of control, that feeling of helplessness, really reduces that. So it helps that child to feel better able to cope with the life stresses and challenges that they face. What we'll do a little bit later on in the session is go through the cycle of self-harm, and that will add some more information and detail about why there is this build-up of tension and what's happening to the body when that occurs. A distraction from problems. So when you're focused on something physical, maybe the physical pain or aspects of the self-harm that's distracting, it can take you away from the problems that you're probably not able to do much about. And our children and young people live very, in worlds where the problems around them are probably adult-based and they aren't really able to change that. All they can do is distract away from that. And using something physical like self-harm can be helpful to do that. So when you're self-harming, a child or young person can feel like an escape from difficult thoughts, that this is an opportunity for them to focus on something maybe a little bit more simple even, or a little bit less painful. Emotional pain for some children and young people is more difficult than physical pain. So escaping from those difficult thoughts is the reprieve that they need to feel able to cope. Sometimes an outlet for anger, for rage, for the real difficult things that they are not being able to change. So they don't want to, maybe they don't have the opportunity to express their anger fully because that might result in consequences. And we have a lot of children and young people who may well physically, emotionally, verbally express their anger. And socially that becomes really difficult. It becomes antisocial possibly. So sometimes, particularly for our children and young people, that anger is repressed and they will show it in different ways, and that way sometimes can be in harming themselves. We have children who feel very numb, who feel very detached, disconnected from the world, maybe from their family, their peers, the exciting things or the interesting things that are going on. They feel very numb emotionally. Physically, they might just really find this, self-harm as an opportunity to feel something, even if that something is pain, and that can connect them back into the world. And that, for some young people, is very important. Otherwise, that disconnection may escalate, and then, we don't, the difficult feelings that go with that can escalate too. We know that some children and young people use self-harm as a punishing tool. So a way of punishing yourself for your feelings and your experiences, particularly if those feelings and experiences carry a lot of guilt, a lot of self-blame, questions if I'd been better behaved, nothing bad would have happened, I'm to blame, I'm at fault. It might be there's been a separation in the family, or there has been abuse or something where that child or young person feels that they deserve to be punished, and that behaviour, the self-harming behaviour, can be perpetuated because of those strong feelings that that's what they deserve. We talked a little bit about control when life feels chaotic or overwhelming, and self-harm for some young people is a way of taking control, a small way in a chaotic and difficult life where they can choose what happens to them, when and how and where. And that control and that little bit of space can really emotionally kind of bring some sort of balance back, particularly when they feel sometimes out of control and there isn't, as we were saying about coping strategies, the huge range of choices, they're not available to these children and young people. And this is what can then lead to further self-harm, and they need to take control of themselves within their particular context. We also know that our children and young people communicate to us with behaviours, and often about how they feel, and they're showing us something about their emotional world. So self-harm can be a way of telling others that they are struggling. And I've yet to meet a child or young person who is self-harming, who's deliberately harming their bodies, and they aren't struggling with something. Do you know, there isn't some challenge, there isn't something that's really motivating them to harm themselves. And there's always a story, there seems to be always a story, their story, and that they want to be able to tell somebody. But we know our children haven't got that articulate, the verbal maybe capacity or the understanding or the knowledge of thoughts and feelings, or maybe the space and opportunity to talk about things that are happening to them or in and around them, which are very much adult-based problems that are difficult to really understand or to explain. So we are kind of given some clues about sometimes the distress that they're in, and self-harm can be one of those clues, one of those communication tools that our children and young people can use. It's a way of saying something that is hard, which can be difficult to put into words. I think that's pretty much what we've just been saying. It's a showing, isn't it? We don't have, I find, I work with thoughts and feelings all day, but it's very kind of challenging, I think, to put that honestly and authentically, without guilt, shame, fear, and feeling too vulnerable, putting them into words. It's like when we have to talk about ourselves and suddenly the vulnerability levels really raise and escalate. Our children feel the same. Talking about somebody else's issues and problems or concerns can feel a little less difficult when it's you yourself. Your vulnerabilities can be really high. So when you're trying to get a message across, self-harming behaviour can be a way of doing that. So turning the invisible thoughts and feelings into something visible, and I think this connects quite well to what we've been saying about the power of this behaviour, about it really connecting and showing the distress. And if we understand this as a coping strategy, and we understand this as, all of these things being the sort of reasons why children and young people self-harm, then I think we can start to get our heads around that, this behaviour can be about turning those really difficult, complex, very highly vulnerable thoughts and feelings into something out there, something that people can see, something that people can respond to and react to, hopefully in a sensitive and supportive way, and give them the opportunity to maybe then share what's really difficult to talk about and really difficult to connect with, and that can be those thoughts and feelings underneath. So what we're going to do, we talked a little bit about that a couple of slides ago. This is how to break the cycle of self-harm. We were talking around the physical responses that can also be happening when a child or young person is self-harming. We've talked about and shown that there are often difficult emotions, difficult thoughts and difficult things going on, which might make a child feel like life can feel really quite hopeless or overwhelming in some way. And that feeling becomes really hard to manage. And we know that then it can lead to increased tension. So we know that a young person or a child might start to feel unable to manage that tension, that difficulty, that emotion. And it's at that point that the cycle starts to just build, where that young person, if they have no other coping strategies, will interject with self-harm, because that way the body will release its own pain relief. There's certain chemicals, endorphins, that are released into the bloodstream that reduce the tension and difficult feelings that that young person or child is experiencing, but we know that that's very short-lived. We know pain relief doesn't last very long. Any pain relief, if anyone's taken any pain relief, we know that within a few short hours we're back to square one probably, and we need to take another couple of paracetamol or aspirin or whatever it is that's going to get rid of our headaches. Well, the self-harming effect on the body is maybe a bit similar, where difficult feelings can start to creep in again, which might be shame or guilt. It might be all kinds of feelings, fear, increased vulnerability. So that triggers the sadness or anger or sense of having no hope, or whatever that difficult emotion might be. And the tension starts to build, and we go through that physical response once again, which is quite an addictive cycle. But it's a sure thing in that short period of time that child will feel better, that young person will feel better. They know that, hence why it's difficult to break that cycle, and it will take time to break that cycle. If we try and interject to break it with a different type of coping strategy, with a different intervention, to reduce the likelihood of using a self-harming behaviour to release those endorphins and to reduce that tension and to start to feel better. And that's why when we're talking about change, we're talking about stopping or being able to stop this behaviour, we want to be able to think about it in terms of practice and time, and finding something equally as effective as the self-harm. It's very difficult just to stop. Sometimes it can happen, really quite quickly for some, but for others it may take a little bit longer. So I hope that makes sense. This is a really common cycle that we see and that we explain to our children and young people and families. We're going to think about some facts and myths. I'm sure we all have some ideas of our own, of what we might already be thinking or might already believe about self-harm. So this is an opportunity to think about it individually, or maybe with whoever's at home, or even in a group setting if you get the opportunity, just to consider what facts and myths that we have about self-harm. So first one, children and young people who self-harm always want to die. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are. You might want to pause and have a little think about that. But what we would say is self-harm isn't necessarily about wanting to die. We've already thought about it as a coping strategy. We've already kind of been thinking about self-harm as a way of releasing tension, reducing that tension and feeling better able to cope. So often children and young people who harm themselves actually want to stay alive. They may hurt themselves to help get through a bad time, but this is because it's a way of coping. And I think that's a really valuable perspective to have on self-harm. And it can also help our reaction, because if we think self-harm is because they want to die, that might increase our anxieties and may impact the way that we respond to our children and young people, and we want to respond to them in the best way, in the most helpful way we can. So I'm hoping understanding that bit can reduce our own anxieties when we're maybe in this type of conversation with a child or young person. So just to bear in mind that most of the things that we talk about when it comes to thinking even around self-harm is self-harm thoughts. Most young people, lots and lots of them, have thoughts and they never actually get to the behaviour. So that doesn't automatically mean they're actually engaging in self-harming behaviour. If we look at the triangle, there's a smaller portion of our children and young people who are actively engaged in the self-harming behaviours that we alluded to earlier in the previous slide when we first started to discuss. And certainly, a very small percentage at the very, very top of our triangle, you have that intention to die. So that's a very small amount of children or young people. So again, I'm just sort of trying to keep things into perspective and to really kind of understand the broad nature of, the likelihood that someone who self-harms really wanting to stay alive and are just trying to cope. Children and young people who self-harm are not normal and should be admitted to hospital. Sounds quite dramatic when you say it out loud like that, but just to see what you think. But when children and young people self-harm, this doesn't mean that they need to be admitted to hospital. They may need hospital treatment if they need medical attention because of the self-harm, but all sorts of people are self-harming, including people in high-powered jobs, Hollywood, and even royalty. So again, we don't want to knee-jerk react or assume or make a kind of judgment in a very negative way, which might prevent a child from talking about their experiences. They may feel very judged and invalidated, and we don't want to overreact because, yes, if there's an immediate physical risk, a hospital, presentation would be appropriate. But you know what? If we think about that child trying to communicate and show us their difficult feelings and share that distress, then that would be a really inappropriate place for them to be going to, because that isn't the space where they would be able to do the important thing that they want to do at that time, and that's to talk about and show us how they feel. Okay. That's just a slide just to demonstrate the royalty and the famous people and all the ones that we might imagine have the perfect life. But self-harm is a behaviour, is a strategy, a coping strategy that has been certainly part and parcel of these famous people's lives, and it doesn't fit with just one typical part of the population. So children and young people are attention seeking. So have a little think about what your response is with that one. And self-harm is not an attention-seeking behaviour. If we just sort of change that word attention to care-seeking, I think that helps us. If we think about this child or young person is really trying to communicate something really serious, they're in a very emotionally difficult place, they're really kind of needing someone to provide them with the support they feel they can't do for themselves. I'm just going to give you a kind of analogy. I live in Cleethorpes, I live on the beach, I see people in the water all the time, but I also see that the Coast Guard goes in and out of that water all the time, and sometimes they're having to go out to people who are in distress and who have alerted for their attention to be saved because they're drowning and they're waving and they're shouting and they need some help. They need that innate need of oxygen, of support to help them survive and help them cope so they can come back to the shore and live the rest of their lives, hopefully. That Coast Guard didn't just brush aside that person's desire for help, that person's communication for attention. He recognised that as a real need. and an emergency, an urgent need to go out and support, bring that person back to shore so they can feel okay, they can feel safe again, and they can use their skills and some knowledge of maybe the tide and the sands and the creeks, and then they can go and manage their lives a bit better. So if you think of our responses to someone who's self-harm, it's not that dissimilar. They're just really saying, please help me. So children and young people may self-harm because they are in pain and trying to cope. They could also be trying to show someone that something is seriously wrong. Like the person in the water showing the Coast Guard that something is seriously wrong. And they need that help to get them back to shore so they've got, they can breathe and they can be safe. And that child is really showing us something seriously wrong so they can feel safe and they can feel able to manage and feel supported so they're not as alone or overwhelmed. And they need to be taken seriously. So the Coast Guard, taking the guy seriously in the water, we need to take our children seriously as well if they're showing us that they need that care and that support. So children and young people can stop self-harming. Have a little think about that one. So, yes, the answer to that one. We need to remain hopeful, and I see lots of children and young people who find safer and more positive coping strategies all the time. So with the right support, children and young people can reduce their self-harming behaviour. And I think to have that understanding is a really powerful message for our children and young people when it comes to taking those first steps towards positive change. But because it is a coping strategy, it's important that they are supported to find different ways of managing their emotions before expecting them to stop and reduce their self-harm. So if we think about the exercise before, when there is no real other opportunity, we don't have a selection of coping strategies, it takes time to practice and replace a behaviour like self-harm, particularly if we think about it when we were talking about the cycle of self-harm and how powerful the impact of that can be on us emotionally and physically. There needs to be some really quite useful and powerful alternatives for a child or young person to feel able to let go of a behaviour that they've come to trust and rely on. And it may take time and they may need help, but things can get better. And often, we've got young people who really want this to change. They don't want the scars, they don't want the shame and the stigma. They want to do something different and they don't want to feel trapped and caught up in a negative cycle. But the message there is, yes, we can support children and young people to learn other coping strategies that can reduce that cycle of self-harm. So let's think about how we can help, with our children, the ones that we love, and we have that huge and positive role that we can play. So there's helpful ways that you can respond, ways that we can use our own our own selves, really. If there was a situation that we were in where we were faced with a child who was talking to us about their self-harm, and we can make time to listen, and we know that we can take them seriously. That's essential. We don't want to be judgmental and brush them off. We can put emphasis on that young person's agenda and what they want to talk about. Allow them to tell you their story and bring up the issues that are important to them, and it's all relative. We might find it difficult and a struggle to really, accept sometimes maybe that, that's an issue. We might want to put our own kind of opinion on that, but just allow that child to tell you what their agenda is. And we can provide that calm space, as best that we can. And nothing's going to be ideal, but just that's really important, because if we're calm and we're in a calm space, we're much more likely to have the opportunity to feel able to build that trust and that communication so we can talk things through. And we're not fraught, we're not anxious, we're not afraid, we're not worried, or we're not pressed for time. And that young person will feel much more able to communicate what's happening if that's the case. So keep an open mind. Just hear what the story is and try not to sort of come in with too many judgments. It's not an easy ask, and nobody, I suppose, who's been in this situation would say, yeah, it was absolutely fine, it was no problem at all. Because we're managing our own feelings, aren't we? And particularly when it's our own kids that might be having problems, or, there might be a sense of, oh my goodness, what did I miss and what did I do? And we have some really challenging feelings as parents and as carers, particularly when we're faced with that. Professionals also would talk about trying to manage their feelings, but I really think, as carers and parents, our feelings around these topics can be even more amplified because, we might be having conversations with our children. So that, but it still means that, where we really do need to be mindful of how we're responding in our own feelings and be in that as calm a place as possible. But we will be managing our own distress whilst we're talking to our kids. And I just wanted us to acknowledge that really together, but just be aware of that. Because how we respond is so important. And if we can respond in that containing and calm way, then I think that will be really, really helpful. And help your child to think about their self-harm not as a shameful secret. Just to kind of think about it like a coping strategy. If we can show that level of understanding and appreciation right from the first time we speak to somebody about this sort of topic, it would be so much more helpful for that child's confidence and trust and self-esteem, and just to kind of their own understanding that their behaviour is for a reason. It's to manage things, it's to help them feel better, and it's not something that should be hidden or pushed away. So that, I think, is something that we can all do. So try not to jump to conclusions. It's difficult because sometimes we want to get the answers, don't we? We want to problem solve and we want to be them, take the pain away, and we want to, get it all done and dusted in 5 minutes. But, it takes a little bit of time. So let your child tell you their story, like we were saying. Try to resolve the problem they may be facing. So, we can problem solve with and together around some of that might help with a perspective. Try not to have all the answers. Problem solving is looking at all the options and weighing up and finding something after a big discussion about what those options could be and what's the best thing to face those, things that might be going on. But the rejection and the pressures that child is facing is their agenda. They're telling you what impact that has. You're not drawing your own conclusions on that. So, you can take care of the self-harm, for example, the wound cleaning if necessary, and sometimes that's absolutely fine to do that at home. It's absolutely fine sometimes to get your child or young person to help with that or to do that. So that's something that that we can do just so we're physically safe. Take the child or young person to A&E only if that medical attention is required. And that's, so if a child has taken a poisonous substance or the wounds really do need that medical nursing attention, a dressing, for example, or even some stitches. Seek help and support if necessary. Don't be alone with this. You might find it helpful to, if your child's involved in Young Minds Matter, to contact Young Minds Matter. They're, finding some education stuff, to contact school. There's lots of different avenues that you can find some, support, but try not to be on your own with these issues. So just going to go on, just for the next few slides, with some skills, just some things that you and your child or young person could do. They could do together, or your child or young person can do by themselves. So we're just thinking about some of the feelings that go with this and how to practice the skills and what to do. And we use distraction, and distraction really is to reduce the likelihood of self-harm happening. So we're really starting to learn an alternative skill when we're feeling those really difficult and powerful feelings. So, for example, anger and frustration, have a break. See if you can practice that 5-minute rule. That's just the gap between the thoughts or the urges to self-harm. So in that space, you could do something really physical, like you could exercise, hit cushions, shout, dance, shake, bite a bunched up material or tear something up, something really physical. That it also increases endorphins. It also helps to calm and regulate that emotion. And it's really kind of has that way of reducing the anger and the frustration. When that's reduced, we might well be in a place where we feel we can talk things through and we can start, we can practice. It takes time and it does take practice. We've got some handouts at the end of this session. You'll be able to access them for some more ideas, but just sort of using some of these examples for you guys just to start that conversation. It's often really helpful to really kind of take this from an individual basis. Some things will work better than others for individuals. Some people might just be really good and find physical things working for them most of the time. But this is just so you're aware that different types of emotion and different feelings can be supported in slightly different ways. So if sadness and fear is the feeling really that's driving that self-harming behaviour, do that when we've had, I could practice that gap, that space to learn to sort of tolerate some distress, learn to tolerate some of that uncomfortable tension that we spoke about. So within that time frame, and we spoke when we were breaking that chain, there's an interjection there where we're breaking the cycle, but we're introducing some positive, helpful, safe strategies. And for sadness and fear, they could be having something that's really nurturing, warm, safe and comforting, like wrapping a blanket around you, spending time with animals, going for a walk in nature, allowing yourself that space to cry. It's okay to show that emotion. You could listen to some soothing music. You could talk to someone and telling them how they feel, which might be the first time. Our kids sometimes really find that quite a challenge, but if they can do that during this time, that can really help to calm things down. So massage, that can be really helpful, and breathing exercises. We know that breathing exercises, deep, simple, regulated breathing, is one of the key things to help regulate our emotions and to help us to feel calmer. So if we can kind of do the breathing and throughout all of these, that also can be really effective. And there's lots of different breathing strategies and breathing techniques. And different ones will work for different individuals. So just going on for another slide for the skills. If there's feeling of shame, that's really powerful. Try and sort of utilise that space, and we can increase that space all the time. When we're trying to sort of manage that distress and that tolerance of that tension. But looking at who can that child spend time with, who can treat them kindly, surrounding that young person, that child with positive people that are interested in their well-being, their confidence, going to support them with positive self-talk, genuine things that they can learn to accept and believe about themselves, about their achievements, their qualities, help them notice something really positive about who they are and what they're capable of and what they can do. When we focus on a negative, it tends to get bigger and bigger and we lose sight of all the positive things. And we can introduce one or two even, positive ideas, statements, things you can practice about yourself that can be really helpful. And like I say, people who are kind and who boost your confidence, and we all need that. We all need that cheerleading people around us who can support when we're trying to feel better about ourselves. If you've got that sense of someone wanting to punish themselves, you've got the 5-minute rule. So show self-compassion. Positive thoughts jar. Maybe like a feel-good kind of box, or the jar or anything where they've got these different ideas of the things that you've achieved, the things you can do, the places that you've been that you've enjoyed. So you've got a whole range of quite powerful things that can shape how you feel, so put you in a much better frame of mind. And again, that's a very individual thing. Photographs can be really powerful, scents can be really powerful. Using your 5 senses, so, you know, within that kind of activity. And you could do that kind of thing together, and sometimes that can be a really creative and fun thing to do as well. So creative activities are really helpful, and again, that physical exercise, never to underestimate just how important that can be. So just some examples there of the skills that you can try. So just finally, really, if you are concerned about your child's or young person's mental health, so you can go to your GP, obviously, and you can discuss that, and referrals can be made. Schools can make referrals to Minds Matter, as well as the social workers or family hubs. And we have access to a carer and parent support line, which again could be an avenue for ideas, and, you know, so you don't feel alone. So alone we can do so little, but together we can do so much. I think again it's about accessing some of the support on the previous slide, and you know, you've already taken some steps here by doing a training session and thinking about some of those skills. So like I say, we've got some references there. I think there would be a pre and post measure as well that you could complete. You know, just work together with your children and young people. They all have their own fantastic ideas on what can help. But thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed this session. Thank you.